You know, it's rather when I was working on the service this weekend, and the topic is the church and saints. Usually I go through and look at the concordance, which lists all the times a certain topic is listed in the church, in the scriptures, and I was looking at church. And did you know, Jesus only mentions the church 2 times in all of the Gospels. He's talking about something that doesn't yet exist, so it's hard to give a long, detailed sermon about the church because the church doesn't exist as he's going to be talking about it. And really the book of Acts is all about the early history of the church and encounters of the church, what the church is, what the church does. But Jesus only mentions the church 2 times in Matthew 16 and Matthew 18 in all of the 4 Gospels when he talks. And I decided, you know, if we're going to talk about the church, we should put those as the 2 of the scripture readings, talking about the church. And when Jesus talks future about the church, these are the 2 things that he emphasized. And the first one of those is in Matthew chapter 16, where Peter makes this great confession of faith. People are talking about Jesus. Who is he? Is he a prophet? Is he a false prophet? And Jesus asked Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, Peter, that's the confession. And that's what the church is going to be all about. Confessing Jesus as the promised Christ and Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that's really what the church has been about. You know, as we think about the church, we proclaim Jesus. And we say, you know, we ask people to look at faith and trust in Jesus. And he's the one who gives answers to the questions we have about time, eternity, heaven, life itself, the universe. And you know what? That confession was very much in contrast with the day of Jesus. And you know, people didn't think that way. But the church lives and exists by this promise and this profession of faith in Jesus. And you know, the world today needs it even more. Do you remember I read this week a story? It was a little short story. And I think it was from a book. And it was about a little colony of mice. And you know this little colony of mice, do you know where they lived? In the bottom of an upright piano. You know, that's a baby grand right there. And you know what a baby grand, the strings and the hammers go stretching out this way. But an upright, actually when I was a kid, my parents had an upright piano. And it goes from the ground and it goes up. And it's a little more compact. But this little colony and families and generations of mice lived in the bottom of this upright piano. And the one thing they talked about, they were amazed, they heard incredible music. And they talked about, I wonder who the unseen piano, the musician is, who plays this incredible music. And then the story went along. One day, one of the mice decided to climb up into the far reaches of this piano and came back and said, you know what I saw up in the heavens? Strings. Short strings, medium strings, and long strings. Wow. Then another mouse decided to climb up into the top of the player piano and went all the way to the top. And you know what he found at the top? Hammers. Hitting the strings. Creating notes. Creating music. And went back down to the mice and said, you know what I saw? Hammers. Hitting the strings. It's sort of a mathematical cadence. On a scale. And then the mice talked about this. They had thought there was some unseen piano player in the world. But then they decided the world was a mathematical and physical equation of hammers hitting strings. And that's the story of all that goes on. Do you know that's sort of a parable of sometimes the way the world thinks now? It doesn't see the one who created and made everything. It just sees the procedures of hammers hitting strings, making notes, things happening. But the world doesn't always see the one who caused and created and made everything, and has made every one of us. One of the things we do with faith is we say, God is very personal. He created a world that happens in ways that we don't always understand. We understand a little bit more. But we see him, as the Creed is confessed, as maker of heaven and earth. Maker of us. But somebody who's very involved in this world and cares about every one of us. And we see that most clearly in Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God. When Jesus talks of the church, that's the first thing he says. The second thing he says when he talks about the church, he says, do you know what's going to happen in the church? In the world? There's going to be conflict. Have you ever had conflict in your life? And you know, conflict happens. Conflict is in all sorts of ways. And it's interesting, in Matthew chapter 18, the second time that Jesus ever mentions the church, when he talks about the church, he says, you know what? There's going to be conflict. And what does he say that first must be done? You need to talk to the person face to face. That's important. And you know what? That's harder in the world, isn't it? We get so more isolated. I don't know, one of the book we've been reading for the book club, I love the chapter that just read last week, and is talk about the problem of even just talking to somebody on the phone nowadays. Have you ever called some corporate number, your insurance company, and you know what? They said, press 1 if you want to hear why you should go to the website. Press 2 if you want to hear 27 minutes of Barry Manilow. Press 3 if you want to hear all this in Spanish. Press 4 if you want to speak to somebody who doesn't know what's going on. Press 5 if you want to go into a longer phone tree. You know, and that's, you know, it's harder and harder to get somebody face to face in the world anymore. And you know, in communication, and where things break down, it happens in marriages, which is incredibly hard. It happens in families. It happens in every sort of environment. And it even happens in the church. And Jesus brings up this instance when he's talking about conflict. He said, you know what? Whenever there's a problem, you know, the first thing you got to do is go talk to the person face to face. And it's harder today. We live in a day of texts, emails. And I think these words of Jesus in Matthew 18 are even more apropos in our world, which seems to be isolated, people withdrawing and being separated in so many ways. But Jesus said, you know, you've got issues, talk face to face. If that doesn't do it, bring somebody else along with you. They could be a mediator, work to get things done. And then finally, as a last resort, get the church involved. The bigger assembly. Do you know this procedure works not only in church, but it works in real life too? You know, it's important to talk about things. And you know, God said back in Genesis 1, he said, you know what? It's not good for man to be alone. And so what? You know, God created Eve. And you know, one of Satan's great lies is trying to isolate and separate people and separate groups. We have problems in so many things, like I said, in marriages and families. We have political problems where one party tries to demonize the other party to split us apart. We have all sorts of things working to separate people. But the one thing God always wants to do is to bring people together and to reconcile them. And that's just what Jesus does. I think when Jesus talks about the church and saying of conflict, he's making the acknowledgement that, you know what? The church is full of people with problems, people with issues. But we're made the church by the grace and the mercy of Jesus. Due to the other topics as we go through the Apostles' Creed, after talking about the church, it talks about the communion of the saints. And you know, saints is a big word, and there's both a wide definition and a narrow definition. The wide definition of a saint is Paul, when he addresses most of his epistles, he says to the saints in Philippi, all the church, the whole church. When Paul looks at us and the scriptures look at us, a saint is anybody who has been made white and pure by the blood and the grace of Jesus. In Revelation 7, that first reading from scriptures when it talks about saints, we're saints because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. We're made pure and holy. There's a narrow definition, but that says, you know what? You're living a little bit more like Jesus. And that's what Jesus ascribes to us. He makes us saints by his grace, but he challenges us to live and to resemble him. But you know, that's hard. You become cynical. You see the problems of the world, you say, well, I can't solve it. You know, I remember reading a story. It was about a couple. It was a rainy night. They went to bed. It was about midnight. And all of a sudden the doorbell rang and it was pouring outside. And the husband got out of bed. He woke up, went to the front door, put on the light, and opened the door. And there was a guy there, obviously inebriated. And the guy said, "Mister, my car broke down. Can you give me a push?" And he said, "What's your name? Where are you from?" And the guy had a hard time answering that. He was really, really drunk. And then finally the guy said, "You know what? Go home and sober up." And slammed the door in his face and went back to bed. His wife asked him, "Who was there?" And he said his name was Chuck. He wasn't fit to drive. He said his car broke down. He wanted to push. I slammed the door in his face and told him to go home and sober up. And his wife said, "You know, that's not very Christian. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to go talk to him. See if we can help him in any way." She got her, put on her bathrobe, went out to the door, turned the light on, stepped out on the porch and said, "Chuck, are you here?" And he said, "Yeah." "Where are you?" And he said, "I'm over here on the swing under your tree. Can you give me a push?" He was obviously inebriated. And all of a sudden her attitude changed a little bit. She thought he wanted help with his car, but he wanted a push. I used to give pushes to the kids every time I walked by the playground, and it wore me out. Because there used to be 8 swings out there. All I remember is every time I'd walk by, and the kids would say, "Pastor Dave," and they'd all run for the swings and hop on, and I'd push them all, and then I'd be exhausted and get hot and sweaty. It's hot here sometimes. And I finally, about 4 or 5 years ago, I said, I can't do this anymore. So. But it's easy to become cynical when you see the problems of others and say, I just give up. They brought this on themselves. But that's not really what Jesus did when he saw the problems in the world. He knew they brought problems on themselves. But he came for every one of us. He came to bring us his incredible blessings. And you know what? When he looks at us, he sees us as saints, made perfect by his grace. He sees us with our problems and our shortcomings, and he says, you know what? I care. When you fall down, even of your own doing, I'm going to help you up. And that's the challenge that Jesus gives us in the church. To resemble him. And do you know what saints literally means? Holy ones. Holy like God. Holy like Jesus. And that's the challenge he gives us. Doing the other thing, as I was thinking about saints this week, Thursday morning, there was a pastor appreciation breakfast at Florida Hospital down in Fletcher. And they had maybe 40, 50 chaplains and pastors there. And they made us breakfast. They gave us coffee mugs, and it was a nice thing. And then they had a panel discussion about prayer. And it was interesting. They invited me to be part of the 6-person panel as we talked about prayer and doing things, customs in prayer. And then they asked us a question: can you talk about a miracle coming out of prayer? And I went back to a woman back in my second church, and when she was 5 months pregnant, she had a sonogram, and the doctor said, "We've got big problems. I think you should abort the baby." She came to me that day in tears, and she said, "I can't do it." And we started praying for her. The 4 months from that day till the baby was born were very anxiety-producing. And I remember going to see the baby the day the baby was born, and the baby was perfect. No issues, no problems, nothing wrong altogether. And everything was perfect. And you know what? I go to a lot of times when the day babies are born, and it's sort of a party. The mom's a little tired, but there's sometimes a party, grandparents, siblings around. But that day was especially a party because, you know what, she was so worried for 4 months. But God was very gracious and good. Do you know, I listened to the other people on the panel, and there was differing discussions going on. Sometimes similar things like this, sometimes people that they pronounced brain dead, and all of a sudden they came out of their brain dead and came back to life and walked out of the hospital 5 days later. But as I was listening to all these, I was thinking about 28 years of hospital calls, and probably I have about 3 or 4 events like that where miraculous things happen and does that. But you know what? A lot of times, sometimes when the doctor says you're going to die, you die. And this verse popped into my head, Psalm 116. I put it in the beginning of the service this week. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. I had read that, in the week preparing for the sermon. I think I've used that a couple of times at funerals over 28 years. And I didn't get a chance to talk again at this breakfast, but I said, you know what? There was a real party going on that day that her daughter was born. But you know where there's even a bigger party? The saints of heaven. When the saints come marching in. That's a real party. And that's one thing when I think of. When I think of God's saints. You, me, and those up there.